There's a thought that a lot of leaders have, but very few want to admit. They look at their team under pressure and think, are these people not tough enough? Now, they might say it more politely. They lack resilience. They're a bit fragile. They need to learn how to cope. But underneath, it is often the same question. Why isn't this team stronger? That question matters because sometimes the issue is not a weak team. Sometimes it is weak foundations, and sometimes those foundations are being shaped by the leader. My name is Tommy Sim, and this is Lead to Grow. Sometimes people do need to become more robust. That's real. I'm not going to pretend every issue is caused by the leader and every employee is simply misunderstood. But I also think a lot of leaders are calling something weakness when it's actually something else. They're calling fatigue weakness. They're referring to confusion as weakness. They're describing poor habits as weakness. They're calling a lack of clarity weakness or calling sustained stress weakness. And in some cases, they're calling the downstream effects of their own leadership as weakness. That's the bit people do not like hearing because my team is weak. Feels like a diagnosis of them. It places the problem way over there. It makes the leader the observer, almost like a commentator sitting above the game. But I may be helping create conditions that are weakening them is a much more uncomfortable thought. That makes the leader part of the system, and that is the resilience blind spot I want to talk about today. So the blind spot is this. A lot of leaders think resilience lives almost entirely inside the individual. Some people have it, some people don't. Some people are tough and can handle pressure, others are soft. So the leadership response becomes fairly predictable. Push them harder, tell them to toughen up. Give them another challenge, expose them to more pressure and hope they eventually become stronger. But resilience is not just an individual trait. It is also the output of the environment people are operating in. It is shaped by the load they're carrying, the clarity they have, the recovery they get, and the meaning they attach to the work. Also the actions they take, the way setbacks are interpreted, and the way the leader behaves when things get difficult. In other words, resilience is not just something you demand from people. It is something you help build. So in today's episode of Lead to Grow, I'm going to unpack what resilience actually is, why leaders so often misread what they are seeing in their teams, and how to think about building resilience in a much more practical way. And I wanted to do it through three foundations that I think matter enormously: constitution, perception, and actions. Before we get into those three, let's slow down and define resilience properly. A lot of people use the word as though it means gritting your teeth and bearing it. Push through, harden up, keep going. But if your only model of resilience is a Victorian dad with a clenched jaw, it is not enough for modern work and is definitely not enough if you're trying to lead a team well. I define resilience as the ability to successfully adapt and respond to challenges and difficulties rather than allowing them to defeat you. Notice those words, adapt and respond. That is very different to merely enduring pain. It's not just hanging by your fingernails. It's not just taking hits until you eventually go numb. It is the ability to meet difficulty, make sense of it, choose a useful response, and keep functioning without being flattened by it. A simple example from my own life, way back when I was playing basketball and I was younger, was physical resilience. When I was a young man and first started playing representative basketball, I was playing under 20s at the barely 17 years of age. Those are the perils of being born in December. The way I played was to drive the ball to the basket, which drew a lot of physical contact. I also enjoyed running and grabbing perhaps more rebounds than what a skinny guard should dare to do. My coach said to me, Tommy, you need to start lifting weights because the contact you're drawing is going to get you injured and fatigued. Now, he did not just say, take the hit and get back up, because I was actually already doing that. He helped me understand that if I wanted to keep playing that way, I needed to build the capability to withstand more. So I started lifting weights. I found the right program for me, paid more attention to diet and recovery. And over time, instead of me bouncing off every single player and hitting the ground, every now and then someone else would bounce off me. That is the point. He was not removing the contact from the game. He was helping me build the capacity to handle it. That is a much better way to think about resilience at work. The goal is not to remove every hard conversation, every demanding customer, every setback, every period of pressure, or every difficult goal. That would be unrealistic, and frankly, it would not develop people either. But if you keep sending people into combat without building their strength, their judgment, their recovery, and their technique, then at some point you're not building resilience, you're just creating injuries. And this is where these three foundations matter: constitution, perceptions, actions. They overlap and each one influences the others. Constitution is a person's basic strength and energy, physically, mentally, and emotionally. Perception is how they interpret what is happening. Actions are the things that they do that create momentum, capability, and confidence. When these foundations are strong, people are much more likely to adapt and respond well. When those foundations are weak, the same pressure can defeat them much faster. Let's start with constitution. When people hear that word, they can sometimes think this is about wellness posters or fruit bowls or someone telling them to do yoga at lunch. That's not where we're going. Constitution is simply the level of strength and energy a person has available to them to meet the demands in front of them. And yes, physical energy is part of that. It includes sleep, health, and stress load. It also includes whether they're operating like a reasonably strong version of themselves or a depleted version of themselves. Leaders underestimate this because we become a backseat psychologist and miss that problems are partly physiological. Someone is more reactive in a meeting than usual. The leader jumps to the person's character. Maybe they're not committed, or maybe they just can't cope. Maybe they're just not cut out for this. Sometimes that might be true, but other times they're just exhausted. They are underslept, overcaffeinated, sedentary, rushed, anxious, running on fumes. In that state, little problems feel bigger, patience is lower, thinking is slower, and emotional control is worse. Big thing that confidence can drop quickly. Then the leader looks at the reaction and says, why are they so weak? Well, maybe because at that moment, they are weak. Not morally weak, not genetically weak, just depleted. Think about it. Back-to-back meetings all day, meetings that go on and on because the leader wants to keep talking. Constant interruptions because something is urgent when really it's just what's on the leader's mind at that very moment. Priorities that change without explanation. No proper recovery after high pressure periods. There's no finishing line. No time to do the deep work properly. And then, surprise, when people do not look calm, sharp, and robust, there you have it. That is like watering a plant once a fortnight with like Coke Zero and then calling it emotionally weak. The old language I heard in my career around this was battle-hardened, battle-weary, and battle-worn. They sound similar, but they are very different. Battle-hardened is what people like to imagine. Someone has been through difficulty and become more skillful, more composed, and more robust, less easily rattled. Battle-weary is different. That person is exhausted by the fight. They've had too many rounds with not enough recovery, and now they just want it to stop. Battle-worn can be the person or equipment showing the visible damage of too much use. Many leaders only think battle-hardened exists, or at least they think that's all that should exist. If someone is battle-weary or battle-worn, they assume the person lacked toughness. So they keep being tough and adding pressure. They keep exposing them to more difficult situations and less comfort. The logic is the strong will become battle-hardened and the rest were probably not going to make it anyway. But people do not become battle-hardened simply because work is hard. They become battle-hardened when challenge is paired with clarity, with support, learning, standards, and recovery. Without that, the same pressure just drains them. Some challenges can make people stronger. Relentless challenge without recovery tends to make them worn down. Think about a customer service team in a growing business. Right? The systems are clunky, customers are frustrated, the team is under the pump. The leader genuinely wants the team to be tougher, so they say things like, hey, this is good for you. Pressure makes you better. You need thicker skin. They leave the team short-staffed because they think it will force people to step up. They keep pushing response times. They do not really fix the broken process because at some level they think, hey, struggle builds character. What the leader thinks is happening is the team is getting hardened by exposure. And what is actually happening is that the team is getting worn down by repeated failure with no end in sight. A battle-hardened team says, that was tough, but we can handle it. A battle-weary team says, oh no, here we go again. Same pressure on the surface, very different foundation underneath. That is why constitution matters. It affects more than whether someone feels tired, it affects perception and action. When you are depleted, your world gets smaller. You become more threat sensitive. You interpret things more harshly and are less likely to think creatively. People become less likely to make the call, have the conversation, raise the idea, learn a new skill, or persist through difficulty. The foundations are weaker. Quick pause before we keep going. Leadership doesn't happen by accident. It's not a one-off event. It's an ongoing investment. So if leadership development matters to you, make it easy to keep it front of mind. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button and tap the bell so every new episode comes straight to you. One less thing to chase, one more way to stay intentional about your growth. And if you believe better leadership should reach more people, then give this episode a like on YouTube or leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. That simple action helps more leaders find the show and helps these ideas travel further than just this conversation. All right, let's get back to it. The second foundation is perception. Perception is how people interpret what is happening. Same event, different interpretation, completely different response. A client complains, a project blows out, a senior leader changes direction, a teammate resigns or a system fails. One person sees this and goes, oh, here we go again, we're stuffed, this always happens, nothing ever works. Another person sees the same thing and says, well, not ideal, what matters most now? That second person is not necessarily smarter, they may simply have better perception habits. This is where leaders have more influence than they often realize. Teams learn how to interpret pressure partly by watching the leader. If the leader catastrophizes every issue, the team learns to catastrophize. If the leader looks to someone to blame every time something goes wrong, the team learns that mistakes are dangerous and defensive behavior is smart. If the leader makes every setback proof that the business is hopeless, people start to believe, well, the business is hopeless. The leader might think they're just venting, but they're also training perception. One useful way to think about this is the circle of concern and the circle of influence. The circle of concern is bigger and includes everything you can worry about. Interest rates, the economy, the market, what another department is doing, what the customer said, what your manager failed to do, the weather, a new competitor, the system that's annoying. The person should have done something different, but they didn't. It's this giant bucket of all the things that can affect you, and it's a very unhappy place to live. The circle of influence is smaller, is what you can actually do something about. What can I say? What can I fix? What can I clarify? What can I prioritize? Things I can learn. What can I change in my approach? That's where agency sits. And agency matters enormously for resilience because one of the fastest ways to feel defeated is to feel powerless. But then you have to ask, what has the team been trained to focus on? Because some managers accidentally lead people deeper into the circle of concern every day. They create a culture of reactivity, gossip, blame, and externalization. There is always someone else to complain about, some obstacle to obsess over, some reason why nothing can be done. The meeting becomes a place where people rehearse their helplessness. That is not a resilient culture. That is just group therapy without progress. A better leader still acknowledges reality. This is not about fake positivity. You do not stand in front of a team that is under pressure and pretend everything is amazing. People are not stupid, but after acknowledging the reality, the leader moves the conversation towards influence. What can I do? What is the next useful action? What do we know? What do we need to clarify? What matters most now? What is outside our control that we need to stop feeding with attention? This is where leadership language matters. A leader can say, this is a disaster. Or they can say, this is serious and we need to respond well. Those are not the same. A leader can say, why does this always happen? Or they can say, what is the problem we need to fix? Those are not the same. A leader can say, you people are hopeless under pressure. Or they can say, we need to build a better response when pressure rises. Again, very different. Now let's get to the third and final foundation, which is about actions. This one is important because people often think resilience mainly is about how you handle things once they happen. And yes, that is part of it. But the actions you take before things go wrong create the conditions in which you are more likely or less likely to cope well. Now bring that back to teams. What actions make a team more resilient? Clear priorities, a useful operating system, regular one-to-ones that are actually about the person, not just operational updates. Recognition that is specific and genuine. Feedback that is not just the manager getting something off their chest. development that continues beyond one workshop, training on the difficult parts of the job, better focus on what is within people's control, and a clear understanding of the high value activities that actually move the work forward. To pause on high value activities, because this was a note I wanted to make sure was not rushed past. I'll do a proper episode on this separately, but for now, HVAs are the actions that disproportionately drive the outcomes that you care about, not just the tasks. They're not just day-to-day tasks. They're the recurring behaviors that you've done consistently and well make the job work. When people do not know their HVAs, or they know them and they're not working on them, they get dragged into the noise. They respond to the loudest voice. They confuse activity with progress. The manager fights fires. The senior manager fights fires. Everyone feels busy. Everyone feels needed. Everyone feels they're doing things, but the right things do not happen consistently. And when the right things do not happen consistently, the environment becomes more stressful, more chaotic, and more draining. And then leaders look around and think the team cannot cope. Well, yes, because the team is being trained into reactivity. This is where the leader's role is so important. A leader who wants a resilient team cannot only talk about resilience when things are going wrong. They have to build the rhythm when things are normal. That is when you clarify priorities. That is when you coach the difficult parts of the role. You develop people and you improve processes and ensure to recognize good work. It's the best time to create the expectation that the team needs to spend time in the circle of influence rather than just in the circle of concern. Because when the pressure arrives, people tend to fall to their level of preparation, not rise to the level of your motivational speech. The trouble is that so many leaders are reactive in this firefighting mode and are forever bouncing from problem to problem because that's their comfort zone. The result is that they don't build the foundations for their team to be capable of dealing with future problems. Feedback should not be a cathartic experience for the leader. If the purpose of the conversation is mostly for you to finally say the thing that you've been holding in, you're probably not building resilience. You might feel better afterwards, but the other person mostly experiences being told off. That might produce short-term compliance. It may not produce learning confidence and adaptability. If you want to know more about conducting feedback conversations, listen or watch the episode on giving feedback. Real resilience is built through feedback that is clear, timely, specific, and connected to improvement, not vague disappointment or character assassination. It's not a speech or a performance from the leader. Clear feedback says, here's what happened, here's the impact, here's where we need to get to, let's work out what we need to do differently. That is much more useful than you need to be tougher. Psychological safety fits here as well, and again is often misunderstood. Psychological safety does not mean no standards. It doesn't mean everyone gets to be comfortable all the time. It means people can speak up, admit mistakes, ask questions, and raise concerns without being treated as stupid, disloyal, or weak. That is not softness. That is how you get better information into the system. If people do not feel safe to tell you what is really going on, you do not have a resilient team. You have a quiet team. And quiet can look calm right until the wheels fall off. I want to add nuance here because it matters. Leaders can also overcorrect. They can hear all this and say, right, so I should reduce pressure as much as possible. No, that's not what I'm saying. Removing all pressure does not build resilience. It can actually make people less capable because they never get the chance to develop strength, judgment, and confidence. A useful way to think about it is stress inoculation versus stress saturation. Inoculation is exposure at a level that helps you adapt. Saturation is exposure at a level that overwhelms the system. A good leader does not avoid challenge. A good leader calibrates it. They ask, is this pressure developing people or is it depleting people? That question alone would improve a lot of workplaces. So what does this mean practically? If you're looking at your team and thinking they lack resilience, I would start with diagnosis rather than judgment. And then ask the hardest question. What am I doing or failing to do that is strengthening or weakening these foundations? Because there's no point complaining from a circle of concern about your team living in the circle of concern. That is just hypocrisy with a better job title. A leader cannot do the push-ups for the person, but they can stop asking them to do push-ups in the middle of traffic or someone throws emails at their head. So if you want a more resilient team, do not start with a speech about resilience. Start by improving the conditions that make resilience realistic. Build a clearer operating rhythm. Define the high-value activities. Reduce unnecessary noise. Train people on the difficult parts of the role, not just the administrative basics. Have proper one-to-ones. Give feedback before frustration becomes a speech. Recognize progress specifically. Move conversations from concern to influence. Use setbacks as information. Protect recovery after these intense periods. And above all, stop confusing visible struggle with lack of character before you've looked at the system around it. Confidence without evidence is fragile. Confidence built on repeated action is much more durable. One other thing, if a leader does not have a good system of resilience for themselves through their constitution, perception, and actions, then it really caps the ability for the team to be resilient. So the resilience blind spot is not just that leaders forget the environment, it is that leaders forget they are part of the environment. And the good news is that small adjustments can compound. A clearer meeting rhythm, a better question in a one-on-one, a weekly win, learn and grateful, a more disciplined move from concern to influence, a proper debrief after a hard week, a protected block for high-value work, a feedback conversation when the issue is still small. None of these are revolutionary on their own, but repeated over time, they build stronger foundations. If you think your team is weak, ask yourself some of these questions. Are they genuinely lacking resilience or are they depleted? Are they actually fragile or are they unclear? Are they poor under pressure or are they constantly living in unnecessary pressure? Are they lacking grit or are they stuck in the circle of concern? Are they unmotivated or are they trapped in reactive work that gives them no sense of progress? Are they avoiding accountability or have they been trained that speaking up is dangerous? And then ask, what foundations have we built that would make it realistic for this team to be strong? Because weak teams are not always made of weak people. Sometimes they're made of capable people inside weak conditions. And strong teams are not strong because everyone was born unusually tough. They're often strong because the environment helps people recover, interpret wisely, act usefully, learn quickly, and keep moving. Resilience is not simply gritting your teeth and bearing it. It is a deliberate practice of setting the right foundations for constitution, perception, and actions. For individuals, yes, but also teams. Once you see it that way, leadership stops being about demanding toughness and starts being about building the conditions in which real toughness can grow. Leadership doesn't grow by accident. It grows because you choose to work on it. Thanks for making the time today. I'm Tommy Sim, and this is Lead to Grow. New episodes come out regularly. Hope to see you again soon.